Ben is trained as a school psychologist, first started in our school district and left us for a short period of time, but now he's back as our principal at Hamilton Soda One. Very excited about that. Ben's professional work has included a PhD in educational leadership from UW-Madison, and his professional interests include educational equity, culturally responsive practices, and trauma-informed practices. So please put your hands together. Ben Burns.
Thank you. I don't know how far I'll be able to wander with this mic, but I'm going to be holding my notes because a lot of what I was maybe going to talk about has already kind of been talked about today. So I've been trying to edit throughout the day to make sure it is still fresh and valuable for you this afternoon. I have a couple of questions throughout because I really like to make all of our learning interactive, which is kind of hard to do with this many people, but I'm going to do my best. Participation is 100% optional. If you do want to participate, send a text. The 37607 is who you're sending the text to, and then the Benjamin Byrne without the S, yes, 368, it was auto-generated, is the message that you send, and then you'll get in the system, and that'll come up in just a moment. So I'm going to start today by sharing with you a really random story about a 17-year-old girl. This 17-year-old girl decided to start a clothing company with her sister when she was 17. And then when she was 19, she decided to start her own cosmetics company. And just within the past year, at the age of 21, she became the world's youngest self-made billionaire. Think about that, age 21, world's youngest self-made billionaire. Kylie Jenner. Anybody heard of Kylie Jenner? Now, is she truly a self-made billionaire? I don't want to take anything away from her, okay? She does have a very famous parent, Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner. She has also been on reality TV since she was 10 years old on Keeping Up with the Kardashians, so certainly she already had access to wealth and fame before she decided to go on these ventures. Again, not to take anything away from what she has been able to accomplish. If you were in Reggie Jackson's session earlier, you saw a lot of slides similar to this about the growing income gap. The rich get richer, any way you want to slice it, okay? So, it's time for our first audience participation. Yes. The number. Yeah, it's going to come up, and it's going to come up. Just a second. Yep. So, when we do a comparison of the rich versus those who are not rich, those who are rich have more opportunity for higher income. They have more access to higher education. They have better health outcomes. But there's this myth of self-made. So many say they're self-made, yet they started on, it's that idea of being born on third base thinking you hit a triple, right? So, tell me, how are you feeling right now? Okay? The number will still be there. Bear with me. Just give me one word. How do you feel right now after hearing that information? Bethany. Yes, this is where the texting participation, because look, it's going to come up here. Answers are completely anonymous. When you hear that information, how are you feeling right now? Okay, we do only have 50 minutes, so all right. I changed 2 words on this slide. Really just 1 word twice, right? From rich to white, from not rich to not white. Now how do you feel? Mad, frustrated, privileged, bridge building. I didn't know that was a feeling. Privileged, underwhelmed, white and privileged, PO'd. I'm going to guess that first time that slide was up, most of us are in the not rich category. And I don't want to make any assumptions, but I'm pretty sure that right now, the second time the slide is up, most of us are in the white category, which switches things a little bit. So what I'm going to talk about today is white fragility. It is a very specific form of white privilege. You have probably all heard of white privilege. You've probably been to talks on it. You're probably sick of hearing about it, even just today. Okay? White fragility, I'm going to dive into it very specifically a little bit, but it is how white people feel, act, respond, behave when conversations about race happen. The reason why this is an important concept, and I'll detail this more later, is that we are not going to be able to change anything in education or in society if we don't talk about it. And so first we have to understand, learn, figure out how to talk about it. I should have brought a clicker. All right. So hopefully in the next 35 minutes, you'll be able to describe a little bit about the socialization of race, describe a little bit about white fragility and provide examples of it in action, describe why it's an important concept, identify it in yourself, your interactions, your relationships, your work, and maybe describe ways you can interrupt it. We have to start with the socialization of race. Two important notes. So this is about learning with and from each other. It is about what is right, not who is right. The other is that racism, privilege, oppression, discrimination, etc., are not intellectual problems that need to be considered, thought about, and solved. Rather, they're emotional truths that need to be experienced. When you are in a privileged position, a privileged class, and a topic of equity comes up, we want to consider it an intellectual problem-solving experience activity that if we just think about it hard enough and long enough, we'll come up with a technical solution to this problem. That is not how it works. If it was, we would have figured it out already. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly because if you were in a couple of the sessions already today, you've probably gotten this information. You probably had it all a lot before. I just want to spend a little more time on some of the pieces that maybe were not already shared. Tim Wise, anti-racist educator, he says in all of this stuff with race, there are no accidents, only precedents. There are no accidents, only precedents. That'll come up again and again. So I'm going to first tell you about a botanist. Did you know there are over 7,700 different types of plants? I had no idea. But Carl Linnaeus, back in the 1700s, was a botanist, and he wrote a book in which he categorized over 4,400 animals, over 7,700 plants and species, and he actually was the first one to categorize, officially in print, categorize the human race into different sub-races. His work inspired the work of Johann Blumenbach, who was the first person to use the word Caucasian, describing the people from the Caucasus region in Eastern Europe, right? And that's where we get that term. It was meant to be talking about a couple thousand people, and now we use it the way that we use it today. About the same time in history, we have Thomas Jefferson. And if you were in Reggie's session earlier, you heard a lot about Thomas Jefferson, okay? Thomas Jefferson actually tried to pass legislation to outlaw slavery. He actually went so far as to say that it is going to be the issue that divides our country, kind of thinking ahead to the Civil War. However, What's important to note about Thomas Jefferson is that he was also the owner of over 600 slaves in his lifetime. And I'm not, rule number one of a PowerPoint is don't put too many words on a slide. I messed up. Essentially, he said some very not nice things that very much contradict a lot of the really good things he did say. And when actions speak louder than words, and you own 600 human beings, that's how we end up with the founding of our country, saying one thing and doing another. All men are created equal, except you and you and you. So author Ta-Nehisi Coates, he says that race is the child of racism. Race is the child of racism. Racism came first, before race. So the first time that Carl Linnaeus and Johann Blumenbach are talking about the different races, human races, was in the 1700s. Does anybody have any idea when the earliest Atlantic slave trade started? The earliest recordings go all the way back to 1526, more than 200 years before Carl Linnaeus. At this time in the point of history, it's really important to know that two things are going on: categorization and colonization. So the work of Carl Linnaeus, he was really kind of the expert in his field, but a lot of people at that time in Europe, in the field of science all over the world, were categorizing things, putting them into categories. Kings play chess on finding green squares, right? The other big thing that was going on in that time in the world was colonization, mostly by Europeans colonizing all these other places out here. How convenient is it when you're stealing somebody's land, somebody's freedom, if you can have a categorization system that says you're superior? And so you can see how Ta-Nehisi Coates suggests that race, developed in the 1700s, is the child of racism, started over 200 years earlier. It's an interesting thought. In the year 2000, the Human Genome Project successfully decoded the entire set of our DNA for the first time in the year 2000. And they said that humans are over 99.9% exactly the same. And at the time, President Bill Clinton hailed this as, we can now move into a post-racial world because science has proven that race is a social construct. But there were some naysayers. There were some naysayers that said, well, what about that 0.1%? That actually represents billions of little pieces of genetic code. There could be difference within there. Well, it's taken almost 20 years, but now a recent study within the last year, what they did was they took about 1,000 different people from each so-called race, and they did a full workup on their genome, their DNA, and they found that the differences within those groups were greater than the differences across the groups. Getting back to a little bit of history, socialization, Irish, the Polish, the Italians, the Jews, all discriminated against terribly at one point in history. Yet all became white. Fascinating book. Don't have time today to really dive into that, but just more context. How about advertising? Racism in advertising. This is a very old ad, obviously, but we have also more recent ads. If you can't see, the sweatshirt says "Coolest Monkey in the Jungle." You may remember this one from about 3-4 years ago. Huge controversy in the news, right? Here's the Red Cross. How to be cool and follow the rules. Most of the people that are not cool are people of color. The girl pushing, you see, and most of the people who are cool, people who are white. How about this one? Do you see it? Where's the black father? You know what's interesting about this? This one hits home very personally for me. I was having a conversation with my dad a few years ago. He was asking me how my studies were going and my work. And I was sharing a lot of these things with him, and he said, I think it's really just the breakdown of the family unit. I think that's the problem with black culture. And this is my father who's my hero and my best friend. And I said, Dad, where do you think that comes from? Right? That was intentional. There are no accidents, only precedents. When we brought slaves over, we intentionally broke up family units so they would not be as strong. When we wrote the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, we said slavery is illegal except as punishment for a crime, which means we can still do it. Jim Crow laws, mandatory minimum sentencing, intentionally designed to break up the African American family unit. Does anybody know? So this was the 1980s, 1986, mandatory minimum sentencing, the Reagan era, okay? And cocaine and crack are the same thing. They come from the same plant. Crack, you add water and baking soda. I Googled it. Don't use your district technology or Aristotle will send me an email. But they're the same thing. Yet, in order to receive the same penalty for cocaine as you would for crack, mandatory minimum sentencing said you had to have 100 times as much. 5 grams of crack was 5 years in prison. 500 grams of cocaine, also 5 years in prison. 100 times. Mandatory minimum sentencing, meaning mandatory minimum. You're going to jail. Who buys and uses crack? Who buys and uses cocaine, right? This is just one more example of the intentional part to break down the family unit. Early studies back in the early 1900s of African family systems, looking at the different tribes in Africa, found that there was a high prevalence of polygamy and buying of brides. That's what these scholars found. Mind you, it was the early 1900s, and the scholars were European, of course, right? More recent studies have found that these rates were terribly overreported. Terribly overreported. We also have buying of brides and polygamy here in the United States too, right? So, recent scholars have found actually very strong family bonds in the African family structure systems, honoring both parents and extended family members. Do you know, in this study, do you know how many African family systems and tribes they found normalized and celebrated absentee fathers and unwed mothers? 0. That's not a thing. That was created here. So it was really hard for me to tell my dad, you're wrong and you're being quite racist right now. But again, it's not about who is right, it's about what is right. How about our socialized norms, pop culture, right? You ever play pool? What don't you want to hit? The black ball is the bad one. Angel food cake, devil's food cake. What do you wear for a wedding versus a Friday night, Saturday night? Okay? Chess. Now, I know you're going to tell me that chess was invented in China like 2,000 years ago. But chess, as it's modernly played today, was remastered in, of course, Europe. Which color always goes first? White. Now, some of these things, some of these pop culture things, some of these advertisements are probably random. They're probably a coincidence, okay? But even that, like, we have that innate socialized response to say, well, it's just a coincidence. It's just random. It's just an accident. And I would encourage you to say, well, maybe it's precedent, even if it's subconscious. How about the stories that we tell? Now, our keynote this morning kind of stole my thunder on this one, right? Because the story is this old, tired woman who had just worked a really long day and just was tired and didn't want to give up her seat. When, of course, she was not old. She was 42, and it was more or less a thought out, planned, coordinated decision. But if that's the story, then it means we're acknowledging that there is a ton of systemic oppression going on. And we don't want to acknowledge that. How about this story? 1947, Jackie Robinson becomes the first major league African-American baseball player. Monumental achievement. Now, do we think that he was the first African-American who was good enough to play baseball with white people? Does anybody know when the first major league or the first professional Negro league got started? 1885. Are you telling me in 62 years there wasn't another player good enough to play with white people? What if I told you that the true story here is that Jackie Robinson was the first African-American baseball player that white owners allowed to play baseball? Because, follow the money, they realized we can make more money if we win more games, and he's a better player, so we want him. So again, even the stories that we've been told, and you've heard this before. You've heard this before. Now, this is not just for blacks, African Americans, right? Does anybody know the only race required to prove your ethnicity is First Nations or Native American peoples required to prove themselves and have to carry around a card? Right? Internment camps, building walls, writing legislation, so on and so forth. When I was doing a Google search for racist ads, I think I came across an ad for racists. Like, they're looking right. But I include it because like you kind of start to see this is true. Racism is as American as baseball. How about in our political things? You've heard of dog whistle politics, right? Our politicians, our strategists, they figured out that after the 60s, we had to start using other coded language in our politics. How about this? In our policing, we know far too much about this, but CNN has an entire page dedicated to what they call living while black. Black people who have been arrested for doing the following things: waiting for a friend at Starbucks, barbecuing at a park, working out at a gym, where I read that story where he was a member. He was doing his daily routine. Somebody thought he looked suspicious, called the police, and they arrested him. You can check that out in your own time. So, colorblind racism, right? We think we evolved when we say we should be colorblind, but you've all probably heard that before, right? I don't need to go into a ton of detail on this piece, okay? We use things like abstract liberalism, okay? So, well, we should get rid of affirmative action because affirmative action gives preference for one group of people over the other, and we don't want to be showing preference because we should all be equal, so we should get rid of it. Not true, right? Explaining racial phenomenon as natural occurrences. Well, I think all of the black people live over in that community because they like to be with each other when we don't talk about redlining and those practices. And if you were in the previous session, you heard about that. They're just simply cultural differences or stereotypes. Race no longer matters. We're in a post-racial world. The Human Genome Project solved it all, right? So it's in the way we talk. It's in the language, okay? So this leads us into white fragility. And it's how we feel when we have these conversations, when we see these statistics, okay? So Robin DiAngelo is his author. She says, white fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it's a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. Racial bias is largely unconscious. And here's the challenge: the defensiveness that it sues upon any suggestion of racial bias. She goes so far as to say that white fragility functions as a form of bullying. I'm going to make it so miserable for you to confront me, no matter how diplomatically you try to do so, that you will simply back off, give up, and never raise the issue again. Two key Western ideologies that she talks about: individualism and objectivity. So in our westernized society, we tend to think more individualistically. Okay, we're all unique and stand apart from others, even those within our social group. Objectivity tells us that it's possible to be free from all bias. These together make it very difficult for us to explore the collective aspects of the white experience. Also, very importantly, to understand white fragility is what she describes as the good-bad binary. Racist equals bad, not racist equals good. So within this paradigm, to suggest that I am racist is to deliver a deep moral blow, a kind of character assassination. Having received this blow, I must defend my character, and that is where all my energy will go, to deflecting the charge rather than reflecting on my behavior. Part of the socialization of race is the differences between it, but also part of the socialization is to not talk about it. Part of the socialization is to buy into this good-bad binary. It's all or none. You can see examples of white fragility in action. Feeling singled out, attacked, silenced, shamed, feeling guilty, feeling angry, feeling scared. Behaviors, crying, denying, getting up and leaving. Focusing on intentions. Claims. Well, I know people of color. Well, the real oppression is blank, right? Well, I just said one little innocent thing. It was just a joke. You can see assumptions. Racism is simply personal prejudice. I'm free of racism. Well, I'll be the judge of whether it's occurred or not. Functions. To maintain white solidarity, to close off self-reflection, to trivialize the reality of racism, so on and so forth. DiAngelo says there are some things that we can do, though. To interrupt white fragility, we need to build our capacity to sustain the discomfort of not knowing, the discomfort of being racially unmoored, and the discomfort of racial humility. While we worry that if we have revealed our racism in any way, the people of color in our lives will give up on us, I have found the opposite to be true. When we engage with the feedback and seek to repair the breach, the relationship deepens. Trying to explain away our racism does not fool people of color or bring them closer. Pause for a moment. I'm going to say that again. Let's apply it to the students in our classrooms or the young people that we're working with if you're not with the school district. Trying to explain away or hide our racism, including our unconscious bias, does not fool students of color or bring them closer. She goes on to say, what would it be like if you could simply give us feedback, us being white people, have us graciously receive it, reflect, and work to change the behavior? Recently, a man of color sighed and said it would be revolutionary. Glenn Singleton with the Pacific Education Group talks about courageous conversations. That's certainly another great way to dive in, to stay engaged, speak your truth, experience discomfort, expect and accept non-closure. All right, participation time. No texting involved, though. Don't think too hard. If the card has a vowel on one side, then it must have an even number on the other side. Which two cards would you turn over to test this rule? If the card has a vowel on one side, then it must have an even number on the other side. Without thinking too hard, we got vowels and even numbers. Raise your hand if you think you're going to flip over A and 4. Because that's the vowel and the even number, right? Well, if we flip over A and say 6 is on the back, and we flip over 4 and let's say that the letter E is on the back, then we know that this rule holds true, right? Wrong. We just have 2 examples of that rule. If we really want to test this rule, we'd pick Q and 7. Because if on the back side of Q, we have an even number, or if on the back side of 7, we have a vowel, then we have some non-examples. We have some examples that go against conventional wisdom. Let me tell you a quick story about a student of mine last year. 5th grader, black, boy. I noticed outside on the playground, hyper competitive, super competitive, aggressive, loud, everything that the stereotype says he should be. And then one day, I noticed him in the classroom. And he was sitting there quietly working hard. And I went over and I started chatting with him. Here he is, he's working on 6th grade math. That was an eye-opener, right? Because when I'm outside at recess, I'm looking at A and 4. I got to work hard on myself to see the Q and the 7. Because when I saw that, now my conversations when I see him, what are you learning in math right now at the middle school? To help nurture that and to see past the A and the 4, if you will, right? So this idea of confirmation bias, because the world has been filling your head with stereotypes. And you have been trained to confirm those biases. And so one way that we can overcome this is to look for those counterexamples. Another opportunity, very not mandatory participation here. Actually, you know what? Just do this one in your head. You're going to come up with a number, all right? Do this one in your head. I don't want anybody to feel any worse than I've already made you feel today. We're going to do a friendship test, okay? So I want you to think about, and you can use race, you can use LGBTQ, you can use socioeconomic status, any way that you can slice that pie, okay? Do a friendship test. And I want you to think, so take a demographic area and think about how many friends you have that are in the demographic category that is different than you are. So think for one moment and come up with that number in your head, okay? But now what if I said that, what if I defined friend in the following way? Not a coworker, not Facebook, okay? They need to be in your phone, programmed in your phone. You could call them right now, and you could have a 10 or more minute conversation simply by starting with, hey, how are you? Does your number change? They have to be in your phone. You could have a 10-minute conversation just starting with, hey, how are you? Because my number certainly does. This idea of counter-narratives is also very important, okay? It is really hard to hate somebody you know well. So who are our friends? Who do we spend our time with? Who do we spend our time talking with, conversing with, living with? Are we seeking out others who are different from us to learn with and from each other, to dive into those counter-narratives? To summarize this section, real briefly, some ways that we can work to interrupt white fragility is to don't stop learning. Assume that you don't know. Lean into the discomfort and ask why. Why is this making me uncomfortable? Accept feedback with gratitude. Seek out counter-narratives, friendships, mentorships. Avoid confirmation bias. Engage in crucial conversations. I've been focused largely on race and largely on the black-white paradigm in this country. These same concepts apply to any marginalized population. All right, here's the good news. You ready for some good news? About 5 years ago, I saw some statistics, maybe it was about 4 years ago, 2015, from the National Assessment of Education Progress. And I was really proud to see that Wisconsin ranked 6th in terms of academic achievement. I thought to myself, wow, we're doing pretty well, 6th. And then I turned the page, and they ranked the black-white achievement gap, and Wisconsin is 51st. For you math majors out there are 50 states, and Wisconsin was 51st. So, East New Hampshire beat us, right? Actually, it was Washington, D.C., but you get my point. And I was in grad school at the time, and I was trying to come up with a burning question. And my professor, he just kept saying, what is your burning question? What is that thing that keeps you up at night that you just have to know the answer to? That's what your research should be. And I'm going over and over and over this data, laying in bed. And all the people that I've worked with, entirely in the state of Wisconsin, the last 11 years, with about half the people in this room, and I just kept coming back to this burning question. And this burning question of mine was predicated upon the following. No teacher gets into education because they want to marginalize black kids. You are all fantastic people who work your butts off every day. Teacher, social services sector, I know not everybody here is with the school district, right? No teacher gets into education to marginalize kids. No kid starts out in kindergarten saying, I can't wait to end up in the principal's office. No third grader goes to school and says, I can't wait to be another year behind in reading at the end of this year, or I can't wait to drop out in 10th grade. No parent sends their kid to school saying, I can't wait for Mr. Burns' call today. It's going to be 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. They know. Yet that's what keeps happening. Why? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like my burning question, like, nobody gets into it to produce these outcomes, but we keep having these outcomes. So my burning question comes into this why? Why? Where's the gap? And then I found a research article by a woman named Anne Hines from about 10 years ago. New Zealand, going back to Carl Linnaeus, was one of those places that got colonized. Okay, New Zealand had the native Maori people, and then they had the white Europeans who came in and took over everything. And about 10 years ago, New Zealand was trying to go through a little bit of a revolution in their education system, trying to incorporate more of the native Maori people's culture, traditions, language, values. But what they found was fascinating. They found resistance to these efforts from both the Maori people and the white European descendants. And Anne Hines, at the end of her study, she suggests that this resistance to this equity initiative, she says resistance should not be thought of just as a construct, as a thing that needs to be dealt with. She said resistance should also be thought of as a developmental process. I'm going to say that again. Resistance is not just a construct, a problem to be dealt with, but rather a developmental process. And so I did a little bit of research, and when I say that, I usually mean I went to Google, but in this case, I actually mean IRB and transcriptions and 335 pages, the whole 9 yards, right? And I found something interesting. First, I need to tell you about this thing called epistemologies. Epistemologies are worldviews, ways that we see the world. And there's three main epistemologies. There is structural functional, interpretivist, and critical. Structural functional is focused on the status quo and the efficiency of the system, not equity. So in education, that might look like we're trying to make our RTI systems more efficient at identifying earlier who needs the interventions and making the interventions more efficient at being research-based so we can identify who has a learning disability, but we're not at all concerned about what happens before all of that, and so we still end up with the same group of kids. We're just more efficiently labeling them. That is an example of a structural functional change. An interpretivist epistemology centers in the subjective experiences of individuals, but the primary concern is focusing on how people are experiencing. It's not necessarily at equity. So we convene a focus group. I want you to tell me, how are you experiencing this? But I don't do anything with it afterwards. As opposed to critical, and now within critical there is critical race theory, there is lat crit, there is tribal crit, there is post-feminist, or postmodern feminist crit. There are all different ones kind of sub-branches, if you will, but essentially, a critical epistemology has a specific focus on power, inequities, oppression, and marginalization, where you're specifically looking at this curriculum is biased and we need to change it, we need to throw it out, specifically due to those reasons. And I'm still failing on my number of words per slide. So, backing up for a second. So, I followed 3 schools that were implementing equity-based initiatives because I said, what is keeping those equity-based initiatives from happening? Because we have educators, we have parents, and we have kids who all want the same outcome. Equal educational outcomes for all. I truly believe that. Yet we have systems that even when we try to make changes, it's not happening. But I specifically wanted to dive into the resistance when we try to make those changes. And what I found was this idea of white fragility, and that anytime we bring up race, or let's transfer that to SES or LGBTQ issues, anytime we bring up the marginalized point of view, it gets icky. It gets tough, and we don't want to talk about it, or we want to do something very structural functional or something very interpretivist and call it good. We're not willing to get into the weeds. And with these 3 different schools, there was one equity initiative from each of these 3 epistemologies. And what I found was that the resistance that we get is very predictable based upon the epistemology. So the more critical of a lens you're going to take with your school improvement plan, the more resistance, the more pushback you're going to get. And white fragility is just one small way that can help us understand why we get that resistance, but we have to treat it as a developmental process. We have to approach it as a developmental process. If you are resistant, that tells me you're engaged. Because if you're checked out, you're in the back checking headlines, and you're not putting up resistance, you're just going to do whatever, right? If you're resistant, that tells me you're engaged, you're hearing what I'm saying, and you want to make it better. It's just, there's something. You got to dive into that more. What tends to happen in our public schools when we try to make equity-based changes is we tend to pit teachers against administrators. We tend to pit teachers against students. We tend to pit one against another because we see resistance to these things as a construct, as a problem that needs to be solved or dealt with or you need to move on, right? How many times have we heard, if you're not, get the bus pointed in the right direction. If you're not on the bus, you got to get it. No, right? So I'm suggesting that we need to rewrite that narrative about equity change. We need to rewrite that narrative about resistance as a developmental process. And by seeking out counter-narratives and friendships, and by engaging in that discomfort, when we lean into it and open ourselves to understanding it more, we will experience that truth in a different way that'll help us to know what to do tomorrow and the next day and the next day. Hopefully, we've gotten some of this. Hopefully tomorrow, when life goes back to 180 miles an hour, we can describe a little bit about the socialization of race. I don't expect you to remember how to spell Linnaeus. Hopefully you can describe a little bit about what white fragility is, maybe provide a couple examples. Maybe you can describe why it's an important concept, at least according to the guy talking. Hopefully you can identify it in yourself and maybe come up with a couple of ways that you can interrupt that. You can just kind of check yourself. One final story for you. When I was going through my graduate studies, I met a person who was in the program. He is of Nigerian descent, but he was born in Boston. His name is Enabuwu, goes by the name of Chooks. And we had all our classes together, became really good friends. He is a principal out in Boston. And one summer, he came and he stayed with my family and I. and didn't think anything of it. Just we're friends, go to classes. But I got to tell you, in reflecting on it, all of the conversations that we had walking to and from class, going to and from class, driving late night dinners after class got done at 9 o'clock, I realized how much I learned. Because if you look at me, you could probably tell I've never been discriminated against a day in my life. And so I just felt this obligation that I need to go out and I need to start educating myself, and I need to start from scratch with no assumptions. And so that friendship has been wonderful for me. And the last thing that I want to share was one day, after he had been staying with my family and I for about a week, we're driving to class. And I said to him, I need to ask you a question. He said, okay. And I said, this week that you've been staying with me, have I committed any microaggressions towards you? And there was a pause. And he kind of did one of these and he said, actually, you know what? You have. And then he told me a couple of things. And what I wanted to say was, well, no, that was white fragility right there. I wanted to say, no, it's not like that. No, you misunderstood me. That's what I wanted to say, but I didn't. I said, thank you. Because I'm still on my own developmental process, my own developmental journey, and trying to understand all of this and how we can do good things for all kids every day. These are just some of the things that I quoted. If you want a copy of this, send me an email. That's it.